Have you ever heard of a war that lasted for decades, involved superpowers, freedom fighters, and mercenaries, and ended not with a clear victory, but with a quiet, exhausted handshake? This is the story of South Africa's long, brutal, and often forgotten war in Angola, a conflict that defined a generation and reshaped an entire continent. In the 1970s, the winds of change were blowing across Africa. As European colonial empires crumbled, new nations were born. But in Angola, independence from Portugal in 1975 didn't bring peace, it unleashed a vicious civil war. Three factions vied for control: the Marxist-leaning MPLA, Jonas Savimbi's UNITA, and the FNLA. This local power struggle quickly went global. The Cold War was at its peak, and Angola became a chessboard for the world's superpowers. The Soviet Union and Cuba threw their weight behind the MPLA, supplying weapons and eventually thousands of troops. In response, the United States and apartheid-era South Africa saw an opportunity to counter Soviet influence, backing UNITA and other anti-MPLA forces. For South Africa, the stakes were incredibly high. Pretoria's government viewed Southern Africa through a security lens. They were obsessed with creating a buffer zone of friendly states to protect the apartheid regime. The African National Congress, or ANC, had bases in neighboring countries. SWAPO, the liberation movement fighting for Namibia's independence, was operating from Angolan soil. The thought of a Soviet-backed, Marxist government right on their doorstep was Pretoria's worst nightmare. South Africa was already occupying Namibia, which it called Southwest Africa, and feared a hostile Angola would become a superhighway for insurgents. So, what started as small, cross-border police actions to hunt down SWAPO fighters soon morphed into something much bigger. The South African Defense Force, the SADF, began launching major conventional invasions into Angola. Their goals were twofold: tactically, to destroy SWAPO bases and secure the border, and strategically, to prevent the MPLA from ever consolidating power. The first major clash came almost immediately. As Portugal withdrew in 1975, South African forces rolled into southern Angola to prop up their allies and stop the MPLA from taking the capital, Luanda. They expected a swift, low-cost operation. They were wrong. Fidel Castro's Cuba responded with shocking speed and scale. In an audacious move, Cuba began airlifting and shipping thousands of combat troops across the Atlantic. Operation Carlotta, as it was called, was a massive logistical feat. What Pretoria saw as a regional skirmish was now a full-blown conventional war against a well-equipped, determined Cuban army. This massive Cuban intervention blunted the South African advance and fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict. The war would be neither short nor easy. For the next decade, from the late 70s to the mid-80s, the Angolan bush became a landscape of relentless, low-intensity warfare. The SADF perfected a hybrid strategy. They conducted lightning raids, sent in elite special forces, and unleashed controversial units like the 32 Battalion, composed mainly of Angolan soldiers fighting for South Africa, and Covoit, a feared counterinsurgency police unit. Their mission was constant pressure: destroy SWAPO camps, cut off infiltration routes into Namibia, and bleed the MPLA government dry. The fighting was a brutal mix of guerrilla ambushes and large-scale mechanized assaults. Behind the scenes, diplomats maneuvered, but on the ground, the guns did the talking. Then, in August 1981, South Africa dramatically upped the ante with Operation Protea. This was one of the largest mechanized military operations the SADF had undertaken since World War II. Columns of tanks and armored vehicles pushed deep into Angola's Cunin province, aiming to obliterate SWAPO and MPLA infrastructure. They captured and occupied major towns, inflicting heavy casualties and seizing massive amounts of Soviet-supplied equipment. From Pretoria's perspective, Protea was a stunning tactical success. It proved they could strike anywhere, anytime, but internationally, it was a disaster. The open invasion and occupation of another country's territory drew widespread condemnation. More importantly, it sent a clear message to Moscow and Havana: South Africa was willing to escalate. And escalate they did. In response to South Africa's growing aggression, the Soviets and Cubans doubled down. They poured more money, more weapons, and more soldiers into Angola. We're talking modern tanks, long-range artillery, sophisticated anti-aircraft systems, and even advanced fighter jets and attack helicopters. The Cubans weren't just advisors anymore. They were a full-fledged army, deployed to protect key installations and lead major offensives. The Angolan bush, once a theater for counterinsurgency raids, was now the stage for massive conventional battles with tank-on-tank combat and intense artillery duels. The cost in blood and treasure for South Africa was rising dramatically. This long, escalating conflict reached its climax in 1987 and 1988 in a place that would become legendary, Cuito Cuanavale. This small town in southeastern Angola, with its strategic airfield, became the focal point of the entire war. The MPLA's army, FAPLA, backed by its Cuban and Soviet allies, launched a massive offensive to crush UNITA once and for all. But the offensive stalled, and they found themselves vulnerable, with South African forces moving in to support UNITA and encircle them. What followed was a series of brutal, grinding battles. For months, the two sides pounded each other with everything they had. The fighting around Cuito Cuanavale has been mythologized ever since, with both sides claiming victory. South Africa will tell you they inflicted devastating losses on FAPLA and the Cubans, halting their offensive cold. The Cubans and Angolans will tell you they stopped the mighty SADF in its tracks, proving that the apartheid army was not invincible. The military truth is complex, but the political outcome was clear. Cuito Cuanavale broke Pretoria's will to fight. The high casualties and the prospect of an even costlier war made them realize that a military victory was impossible. The stalemate on the battlefield finally opened the door for a diplomatic solution. With both sides exhausted and the Cold War itself thawing, the world's powers pushed for a settlement. After intense negotiations, a landmark agreement was signed in New York on December 22, 1988. The Tripartite Accord, signed by Angola, Cuba, and South Africa, was a grand bargain. Cuba agreed to a phased withdrawal of all its troops from Angola. In exchange, South Africa agreed to withdraw its forces and, crucially, to finally allow unsupervised elections for the independence of Namibia. It was the end of an era. Over the next few years, the foreign armies went home. In March 1990, Namibia celebrated its hard-won independence. South Africa's long border war was finally over. But peace did not come cheap. The human cost of the war was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of people died, and millions were displaced. The conflict left deep, lasting scars on Angola, Namibia, and South Africa. For South Africa, the war was not only financially draining, but it also fueled growing dissent at home against the apartheid government's military adventures. Within the SADF itself, the war forced a reckoning, leading to reforms and reassessments. The tactics used in the war were often brutally effective. Units like the 30th Battalion became legendary for their battlefield prowess, but also infamous for controversies surrounding their conduct. South Africa mastered mobile, combined arms warfare, but these tactical victories could never solve the underlying political problem. They could win battles, but they couldn't win the war. Today, the memory of the war is contested. Depending on whether you're in Pretoria, Havana, or Luanda, you'll hear very different stories about who won, who lost, and what it all meant. For many South African veterans, it's a story of tactical brilliance and sacrifice in a war that their politicians ultimately abandoned. For Cubans, Angolans, and Namibians, it's a story of heroic resistance against apartheid aggression, a struggle that led directly to Namibia's freedom. The war's long shadow still hangs over the region. Though South Africa withdrew, Angola's own civil war raged on for another decade. Yet the 1988 Accords remain a powerful example of how even the most brutal conflicts can end, not with a final, decisive battle, but with the realization that the price of continuing to fight is simply too high to bear. Thanks for watching. If you found this history of the Angolan border war interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into a forgotten conflict. See you next time.